We are studying American history from the beginning, an introduction of the European settlers to the Civil War. But in order to understand what the European settlers meant when they got here, you do have to understand a little bit about who was already here. So we're going to spend today just talking about who was on the land when the Europeans got there. And it's long. It's thousands of years of history. We make the mistake of thinking sometimes that it was an uninhabited land, that there wasn't anybody here. That's just simply not true. What the Europeans found when they landed was a continent basically full of nations. Now, they were sparsely populated, and we'll talk about why, but it wasn't a barren land with no people on it. They actually moved into it, and it wasn't a homogeneous land with one people on it. It wasn't like an entire continent of the same tribe. Now, I know that on some level you already know that. I know that you're intelligent people and you already know that. But let's talk a little bit about their history so that we get a better idea of what that looks like. We don't actually historically know a lot about the tribes that were here because we are historians, and what did they not leave a lot of behind? Documentation. We study documents to study history. And most of the indigenous American civilizations passed their history on through oral tradition. So they taught to each other through speech, through poem, through all kinds of things like that. So they didn't leave a lot of writing of documentation of their own culture. Oh, hold on, I gotta do a thing. Okay, y'all gonna tell me your name so I can see it? Yeah. All right, and
Hutchins.
Okay. Sorry. I rely heavily on people's mouths moving. It's a little hard. I can't wait for this. Okay. All right. So what we don't know about them, we kind of fill in the blanks with what we know about almost all other primitive cultures, because primitive cultures are very predictable. They follow a very predictable pattern. Primitive cultures form around two basic important activities: follow the food and flee the weather. They follow the food by finding places where they can forage for edible vegetation. They follow where it naturally already grows. They follow the food by hunting, finding places where animals hang out so that they can kill them. And then they follow the food by moving to the coastlines and places where they can fish, rivers and coastlines and places where they can live, but then they can also fish. They do that they move to a place that has food, and then they kind of, follow it wherever it moves out of. If they start to deplete the herd or the herd starts to move away, they follow the herd out and continue to move with it. They flee from the weather. They find places with livable climates, a place that won't kill you just by walking outside, and predictable climates for preference, a place where you can be pretty sure that if there is a rainy season, you can guess when it's going to begin and guess when it's going to end. They tend to move out of places that are unpredictable and settle someplace else just because they keep losing family members to hurricanes. They move to places where the shelter can be found, so places where there are large cave systems, places where there are dense forests, or places where shelter can be built quickly and efficiently and then picked up and moved, so coastlines. This is very predictable. Primitive societies form families which are centered around growing strong offspring. Those strong families then form larger families, extended families, which turn into clans, which turn into tribes, which turn into villages, which turn into whole nomadic peoples that move. Okay, that's just all part of the primitive society, very predictable. You can always find evidence of these steps happening. The more food you can find and the less weather you have to flee from, the stronger your offspring are going to be. And then you become the dominant tribe in the area. Once you have begun to settle and find answers to those important questions of where am I going to find my next meal and how and why is nature trying to kill me, you start to ask other questions like why does nature behave the way that it does? And then your family begins to answer those questions with stories that make sense to them, and so you begin to form belief systems. In most primitive cultures, belief systems take the form of what's called animism. Animism is the belief that the spirits that are guiding you are reflected in the nature that's around you. So you see things like places that have personalities. If a place is nurturing, it takes on a sort of motherly, persona. If a place is angry, it takes on angry demon persona. If a lot of people die in that place, it becomes a dark place with its own personality. Same thing with animals. If you learn a skill from an animal, because it's something an animal does, and then you learn that skill from them, then it's easy to get from that to the rabbit god taught me how to run, you know, and suddenly you have a whole pantheon of animal gods that teach you things or bother you a lot. If you are constantly being plagued by spiders, then the spider god is going to be something that takes form in your civilization and starts to have its own stories. Animistic cultures are very heavy on ancestry. They believe that their ancestors are still either with them or need to be honored or need to be appeased, but ancestor worship is a big part of animism. So, and animism tends to be matriarchal, which means that it tends to focus on a mother and the path of motherhood through where your blessings come from tend to be based on a mother rather than a father. So most primitive cultures end up here in animism. And then from that, they begin to shape other belief systems. These are things that we already know about the way primitive cultures form, and we basically fill in the gaps with what we don't know about Indigenous Americans with this information. If we don't understand something they're doing, we just look at the way other primitive cultures have done it, and then because the populations that exist today are not reflective of the populations that existed back then. The populations that exist today can't tell us what life was like for the indigenous. Whatever they've managed to hold on to, they've held on to through catastrophe. And so we can't see what the whole society is like. Yes?
Will this be on Blackboard?
This will, yes. Yeah. The PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there'll be a PowerPoint with notes, and then there'll be the video. So any reviewing that you want to do is fine. So where did these people come from in America, these primitive societies in America? Well, between 25 to 30,000 years ago, there was a major climate shift that took thousands of years in which the temperatures lowered and glaciers formed, ice formed, massive glaciers, which sucked water up out of the ocean, which caused the land levels to rise. Does it make sense? The water levels fell, so the land was exposed. So, and when that happened, it happened over the course of a slow period, and during that time, animal herds began to move across this land, and so the people began to follow them across this land, and a whole population of people moved from Asia and Europe and Africa over into the Americas by following the food and fleeing the weather. They came several different ways. Everybody's favorite way to talk about is the Bering Land Bridge, which comes across Russia. Now, I guess what would be Russia now? My mouse comes across Russia, but there's also evidence of a population that came across Southeast Asia and bounced across this piece of land here. If you look at the American continents, you know that they're subdivided by a great big mountain range. So the populations that landed here tended to move across the west coast. The populations that landed here tended to move into the middle. We also now have evidence of something called the Kelp Highway, which comes across this area here. So island hopping from the Philippines and from Indonesia, which is where kind of the Moana. How many of y'all have seen Moana?
That's the Polynesian.
Yeah, the Polynesian and all these islands here, kind of an entire culture of people that has shown up here. And the explanation is that when the water levels fell, there were islands that were exposed and made it possible to hop from one to the next and settle and move and settle and move. And you know, eventually they end up in South America.
Was it really a bridge or not?
It was just exposed land. It was just a great big wide piece of land that is now underwater. When the climate began to warm back up again, the glaciers melted, the water level rose, and that land became covered. So it was a exposed piece of land. So these are all the ways that people ended up, and then when the water level rose again, they ended up cut off from Europe and Asia, and they didn't notice. I mean, they didn't go, oh no, Mom! They didn't do that. I mean, we're talking about thousands of years of movement here. But what ended up happening is an entire culture of primitive people still on the move, still following the food and fleeing the weather, all on the American continents, okay? So the Palo-Indian Americans, or the Amerindians, come into this area by crossing these land bridges, and then the vegetation population changes, the herds move, and so they end up settling these river valleys here. At some point, some brilliant people within these societies say, why are we still chasing this food? Why don't we just grow it where we're at? And that moment where, and it's not a moment, it's usually dozens and hundreds of years, where people start to plant food instead of just foraging for it, and where people begin to herd animals instead of just chasing them, is usually called the agricultural revolution, or the Neolithic revolution. Neolithic, which means new stone, because they start to use tools in a new way in order to grow food instead of just finding it. This happens in almost every primitive society. Suddenly people start to settle and grow their own food instead of just following around all over the place. This happened in the Amerindian societies about 10,000 years ago, between 10 and 15,000 years ago. And when they began to settle and have their agricultural revolutions, they did what all primitive cultures do. They began to invest in their own technology. They began to develop the tools to make their lives better. Every culture has its own technology that kind of shapes everything else. They solve a problem with the technology and then they try to solve all the problems with that same technology. For example, the Greeks invented the pottery wheel. Ancient Greeks, ancient Mesopotamians really, but invented the pottery wheel and used it to make pots, and then somebody turned it sideways and went, look what else it can do, and then began to hook things up to it. And so their entire technology is based on things that are pulled by weight. And by the way, so is ours, as a result of that. That did not happen in South and Central and North America. They did not invent, it's not that they didn't invent the wheel, it wasn't a useful solution to their technology. In Asia, it was about domesticating horses. In the Mediterranean and the Baltic states, it was about boats and better and better and better ways of transporting things over water. In the Americas, most of the technology was about agriculture. American tribal peoples developed agricultural tools that would become incredibly valuable to Europe later. They invented tools. They were the first people that we know of that did GMOs. They did genetically modified organisms. They took plants that were not very good to eat and then bred them and nurtured them so that they would produce kernels that were good to eat. And so they turned something that was not really that edible into something that was extremely edible and was something they could base their entire food supply on. That happened with a lot of other plants too, but corn is the easiest one to see. Because what a pumpkin actually looked like in the ancient days is kind of like not that different from what it looks like now, but the inside is different, so it's harder to see. Corn is the most obvious one. Because they were able to grow so much extra food, their societies were able to flourish. And of course, inevitably, every primitive society, once the villages start to get settled, start to have goods to trade with one another. So they begin to trade with one another, and I'm going to trade with you, and you're going to trade with her, and she's going to trade with him. And at some point, why don't we all just meet in the middle? And why don't we build something in the middle so we all know where the middle is? And so let's build something tall that you can see from a long way away. And every primitive society eventually does this. They build something tall. Usually that thing is some kind of pyramid. Why is it a pyramid?
It's the easiest.
Because the pyramid is the easiest thing to build that won't fall over. But so you have pyramids in Mesoamerica, you have pyramids in Mesopotamia, you have pyramids in Africa. That's because it's the easiest shape to build. But it's not always a pyramid. When you build this, whatever it is, this tall structure, it's called a ceremonial center. It's a place where you centralize all your worship, and you centralize your market and your trading, and eventually that's where your most powerful people live, and because they want to hold on to their power, that's where they build their armies, and that becomes a ceremonial center. In North America, the people that were building ceremonial centers are collectively referred to as the Mississippian cultures, or the Hopewell cultures. And that's because they're building along the Mississippi River, basically, the Mississippi River Valley. They're not all related to each other, but they did have a lot of things in common. They had a lot of practices in common. We know that they built massive earthworks, that their tall thing that they built was a mound, and from the outside, it was a hill that was structured, and then on the inside, it had all kinds of things going on. And then at the top, it would have some kind of structure like a temple that you could see from a long way off. We know that they shared gods, and then eventually they sort of smushed all the gods together and agreed on some fundamental gods. So you have like the falcon and the eagle. They kind of mean the same thing. It's a sky god or the god in charge of the weather and some kind of big bird that everybody's familiar with. The underworld is almost always represented by a snake across all of these tribes. They all just kind of agree that this is probably accurate reflection of the world. One example of that is it's like on the border of Illinois is Cahokia. And you can see that the structure is still there. You can still see the mound that they built, although a lot of time has passed. And if you look at what it looks like, this is this mound here. And you can see how far out the dwelling places around it are. You can see that it was a city. I mean, we're talking about a city here. You know, it was built probably about more than 10,000 years ago. The Hopewell interaction sphere is very similar to the Mississippian. It's the same river valleys. They just have slightly different languages and slightly different roots. So we consider them two different cultures. That's right. But that is definitely a conversation for a different history class. They also agree on the snake and serpent ideas, and the Hopewell are more along the southern coastline, so when we get into Central America, that's kind of where they come from. About 10,000 years ago, something happened to the Mississippian and Hopewell cultures. We don't know what, we just know that all of a sudden, all of these ceremonial centers disintegrated. The people that were living there moved out. There was a huge decrease in the population. We don't know what happened. There is some evidence that there might have been a volcano, and that volcano led to an extended period of famine. There's some evidence that the climate just changed a little bit and people couldn't grow as much food and had to move out of the ceremony. We don't know. It was before Europeans got here, so we don't know. What we do know is that when that happened, they broke apart and then began to grow up separately and develop all of their own languages and their own stories and their own beliefs. And that's why by the time the Europeans got to America, there were so many different tribes already living here, and negotiating with one of them was not negotiating with all of them. They were incredibly diverse, from the Pueblo peoples that built, their homes into the middle of into the side of rocky hills over in southwestern America, to the Caddo, who built right here where you are now. And you can still see some of these sites locally that they built these, they developed their own technologies, they developed their own crafts, their own arts, their own stories, their own languages. They were incredibly diverse. The first Europeans to actually make landfall amongst these people were really the Vikings. Leif Erikson was famously supposed to be one of the first Vikings to ever land in the Americas. But they weren't looking to settle, they were just looking to trade and find things to trade and steal, and that was all they really wanted, were more resources to take back home. So we don't consider them European settlers. So somebody says, who were the first European settlers in North America? And somebody else says Leif Erikson and the Vikings, ha ha ha, I got you. They're wrong. They weren't settlers, they were explorers, but they weren't settlers because they never established. There's a possibility they left some people behind, and that those people over time married into the tribes and their genetics kind of disappeared. There's just enough evidence of the language surviving that by the time the Europeans got there about 500 years later, that they still remembered some of the Viking interactions. There's some evidence of that, but really they didn't get very far. They hopped from the Viking homeland to Iceland and then to Greenland, and they were always just striking out to find new places to. Did y'all ever watch that show, Vikings? Yeah, they argue in the very beginning, like the first episode, about whether to go east or west. And this is them going west. That's basically all it is. But they end up in Newfoundland, which is like in the very northern tip of North America. So at best, they end up like up here. So what caused Europe to start coming into this area was Christopher Columbus. And that's why we need it. It's his very own holiday, even though mostly he was lost. Christopher Columbus was a scientist and a mathematician, and he was using the information that he had and the math that he had to determine the size of the planet, and he was mistaken. He believed that he had calculated the size of the planet based on the size of the moon and the time it took the moon to, he had very complex math that he used. Very cool. Wrong, but it was a good idea. And he had figured out that the distance between Europe and China was not that great, and then you could go the other way and get there faster, and then you could get to India. He didn't realize that his calculations were off and that the planet was actually big enough for an entire other continent to be between him and China. When he landed, he made 4 different voyages, and it wasn't until after his 4th voyage that somebody said, dude, I don't think that's India. I think maybe you found something new. And when that happened, they started to suspect it around 1494 and decided to start laying claim to it, Portugal and Spain, because Columbus was kind of attached to both. And so his discoveries were either for the Portuguese king or for the Spanish king, depending on who you asked. So they came up with a way to divvy it up. They just drew a line across the globe and said, whatever's on this side of it is ours, and whatever is this side of it is yours. And the Portuguese got everything that you see in blue, because here's the line, the Treaty of Tordesillas line. Here's everything in blue, and here's everything in red, because they had no idea that this was not just a chain of little tiny islands. The Portuguese, they didn't know. They assumed there was just a tiny row of islands and that Spain could have them if they wanted. Oh well. When Spanish conquistadors actually started to come in, as you can see, he landed here, he landed in Cuba. These are actually small islands. And they set up a base here. And then explorers started to explore this coastline here. Hernan Cortez was really the first one to decide to go deeper into the landscape. He was expecting to find more of the same, more of these islands, tribal people, pretty primitive. What he found instead was Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan is a city in Lake Texcoco in the middle of the Mexican basin. And at the time that Hernan Cortez got there, it hosted about 200,000 people in the city center, and about 40,000 people passed every day through the market, which made it twice as big as the biggest European city that you could possibly see, which was Constantinople. At the same time that Hernan Cortez found his way to Tenochtitlan, London only had 40,000 people in it, and that includes the countryside. They were not prepared to find this when they got there. They were surprised to find this incredibly diverse, sophisticated society. So where did they come from? Well, that thing that happened with the Hopewell and Mississippian Indians, where they kind of broke apart into these other separate civilizations, a lot of them wandered down into Central America. Among them was the Azteca, or the Aztecs. The Aztecs moved into that area on the promise that they would be given a homeland by their god, Quetzalcoatl, or Huitzilopochtli, sorry, and you don't need to know any of that, but it's fun to say, Huitzilopochtli. They had been promised by their god that they would be led to a homeland. There was another people that had a similar story, the Inca, who were told that they would be led to the place where the sun god wanted them to settle. And basically what they did was move into an empire that already existed, and then as mercenaries take it over and become the warrior class and then the ruling class. And that's what Cortez found when he got there, was a ruling class of warrior people, the Aztecs, who had been in this incredibly sophisticated tributary empire, collecting tributes from hundreds of miles around for about 100 years by the time he got there. They'd only been in power for about 100 years. They'd only moved into the area in the 1300s. Now we're in the 1500s, so I guess 200 years. They'd only taken power about 100 years before. But he only had a small contingent of soldiers with him, and yet somehow he defeated them and took over the entire tributary Aztec empire, Hernan Cortez did. On the other side of the mountains, Pizarro, with a small contingent of soldiers, took over the entire Inca empire. How did he do it? Anybody besides Jordan want to hazard a guess? Yes.
Didn't Cortez make a treaty with one of the tribes who wanted to take down the Aztec Empire?
He did. He made a treaty with the Tlaxcala.
And they gave their princess, who is now one of the Malinche, which kind of helped them navigate in.
Yeah, La Malinche was very helpful in helping him negotiate all these treaties, but even so, there's no way that with what he had, he could have done. Yes.
He had armor.
He had armor, that's true, but they had very sophisticated weapons, the Aztecs did. They had obsidian weapons with blades that were, do I have that? I don't know. No, I don't know.
No, that's the other car.
Yeah, they had obsidian blades and they could throw spears long distance, and well, he had horses, but he only had like 100 men. Yes.
There's also the disease and stuff.
There it is. What were you gonna say?
Very dirty man.
What were you gonna say?
Disney.
Okay, so in order to understand why the Spanish were so deadly, you have to understand something about the way things move, okay? Resources move along latitudes, okay? They move on livestock, so the livestock has to be able to survive. So it moves along latitudes because latitudes all have kind of the same climate. Asia, if you'll notice, Europe and Asia is built along a long latitude. It starts all the way in China, and it's not a straight line, it's just that it's horizontal. It starts over here on the eastern coast of China and goes all the way to the western coast of Europe, and it's all basically the same set of latitudes, which means all the animals that can survive and thrive in China can survive and thrive in Europe. So trade happens across a big latitude, which means that every technology, every new invention, every new food source, every new kind of breeding livestock, everything that happens in Asia in any place ends up pooling right up against the western coast of Europe. So by the time you get to Portugal, you have everything in its most processed form arriving in Portugal. The horses that didn't do very well don't make it all the way out there. The technologies that don't work very well don't make it out there. The food sources that can't survive and can't be planted don't make it to Portugal because everything moves along the latitude. And one of the things that moves along that latitude is disease. So diseases that start in, like the coronavirus, starts within an animal and then transmits to humans, mutates to transmit to humans, and then humans carry it, they have to be carried along a similar latitude in order to reach. Say what? No, that's how the Black Plague worked. It moved along a latitude. Yes, exactly. So by the time we get to the 1500s, the people who survived in the western coast of Europe are carrying antibodies to this wildly diverse collection of really interesting diseases. Because if they weren't carrying the antibodies, they would have died. So they carry the diseases and the cure within them. They carry the diseases and their own resistance against them within them. And then they hop across to the Americas. When they hop from Portugal to the Americas, they meet a civilization that's built on a longitude, which means that they don't trade diseases up and down, which means that their bodies do not possess a really diverse set of resistances. So that is why by the time when Cortez got there, when Columbus got there, he introduced this one product to the people that spread wildly because there was absolutely no resistance to it and was incredibly deadly. By the time Hernan Cortez got to Tenochtitlan, the beginning of what we call the, what is it called? It's a collapse, an absolute collapse of the population. 99.1% of the population was killed by the diseases that had been brought by Columbus less than 20 years before. So 1492, 30 years before. So within the space of 30 years, 99.1% of the population was wiped out. So just, imagine that for a minute. If I was to take this class with just you people in it and say, we're going to take over the city of Dallas, just us, that would be comparable to what happened here. We're going to march on Dallas, and by the end of the day, we're going to control it. The only way that would work is if most of the population of Dallas was out for the count for us. So that's how Cortez did it, okay? And he didn't do it on purpose, but I don't think he thought it was a bad thing necessarily either. So what we call that moment of exchange of things between cultures, we call that the Columbian exchange because we base it on Columbus. Columbus introduced these things to the indigenous Americans and took some things back with him. He took maize, beans, tomatoes, he took squash. He took these things back to the European Trading Center, which we'll talk about a little bit more next week. He brought with him cows and horses, and if you can imagine, these were not things that already existed here. There were no, there's evidence that in ancient times, there was some kind of large four-legged horse-looking thing in South Central America, but it wasn't what you would picture as a horse today. It was more closely related to like a slightly skinnier buffalo. But horses did not exist anywhere on the Americas until the Spanish brought them, and then they went and they bred all over the place. And they became a part of the culture. He brought cows and other livestock, which for a society that has so much tribute coming and going, to imagine that there are no carts being pulled by large animals is really hard for me to imagine until you look at the landscape and realize that those wagons would have gotten stuck anyway. So they relied on porters to carry everything, which created a slave class, which created an underclass. You know, that was their whole society until they had cows and other livestock that were brought in by Spanish. They brought Christianity in some form. Whole separate subject. They brought multiple races into the area because with the Spanish came African slaves. With the Spanish came the melting of Mediterranean cultures. And so you had diversity of races that was introduced, and then as they intermarried into the local peoples, they created new categories. So they brought that, and then of course they brought germs.
Does that really get to Vaca when he's still, because he's really called Cabeza de Vaca,
Cabeza de Vaca?
the explorer?
Yeah, he was an explorer at the same time, actually. He, around 1519 is when he explored the southern coast of Texas and the southern coast of Florida and Louisiana, that whole area there. There was a headquarters. Let's see if I can get that good. There's a headquarters here.
Yeah, because his name is literally kind of a cow.
Yes. Yeah, cowman. Yes. So there's a headquarters here, and from here, the Spanish and Portuguese sent out explorers to all of these different areas. They sent Pizarro this way, and they sent somebody up here that found California. De Vaca led an expedition here. De Soto led an expedition. When they settled Veracruz, they began to send out expeditions from there. And the reason why they were so is because Hernan Cortez discovered Tenochtitlan, which was filled with gold. There was so much gold, and gold was something they used in their daily lives. And he was like, where's all this coming from? And then they flooded the Spanish market with gold, which changed the value of gold. But yes.
What would they use it for?
They used it for ceremonial things. They used it as adornment on their buildings. They did use it for coinage, but not as much as you might think. Gold wasn't as valuable as, for example, certain kinds of feathers.
So they didn't use it for like material things, you know, like.
Yeah, I mean, they used it for jewelry and stuff, but they didn't use it as much for
Like
coinage.
useful things.
No, like you can't cook in gold. You can't like use gold in a hammer. It makes a nice building material, but on top of something else. You can lay it over something. But there was a lot of it in the countryside, so they were like, well, this is nice and shiny. And it doesn't tarnish. You know, gold can be polished no matter how old it is. So that's nice if it's going to be on the outside of your building. Keeps it shiny, you know. But they didn't feel about gold the way the Europeans felt about gold. As a matter of fact, they were surprised that gold was what the Europeans wanted. They were like, we make our streets out of this, you know. So
Because at the beginning, didn't they just say, here, have as much?
yeah, they were like, you want gold? Take gold, thinking that they could go away now that they had gold. But then they were like, well, there's more gold. So we're going to come and take more of it. And then they just stayed forever. So this is the civilization that we have when we, okay. So that's the civilization that we have when we land, kind of, when the Europeans land. The culture that we're going to be studying doesn't land in the place where the big huge cities are. They land in the broken cities in North America, the broken tribes in North America. The reason they go in the first place is because of what Cortez found in South America, in Central America. It's because of that. That's the reason that all of the European countries decided that they needed to have land in the New World somewhere. So that's why we have to talk about that. Yes.